Welcome back to the workshop. I'm really happy with how things are going so far, but currently the swing arm is supported by two bungee cords. I'm not entirely convinced they provide the right damping for when I'm out on the road. So I'm going to have a go at refurbishing the shock absorber. I've not done this before, and officially speaking, it's not a serviceable unit. It's just considered one part in the book, and there's nothing in the manual. But I've done some research on the general process, and I think it's worth having a crack at. As you can see, it's seen better days, though I am optimistic that a lot of this grime should just clean off. Even with the preload adjusters all the way out, I still needed to compress the spring slightly to get the spring seat out. Moving the bump stop up the shaft helped. The spring itself had some corrosion, so I'll need to blast that and give it fresh paint. All this hardware can be cleaned up and zinc plated too. With the spring now off, I can give it all a quick clean up to make taking it apart a lot less messy. I had a go at trying to pop the reservoir cap off without damaging it, but I couldn't get any purchase, so I drilled a hole and pulled it out with a screw and a hammer. With that screw now in orbit, I removed the dust cover off the Schrader valve and let out what remained of the nitrogen inside. I took the valve core out too, as I replaced this for peace of mind on reassembly. Then I got to work tapping out the end cap. I couldn't press the seal head down by hand, so I used an offcut of some aluminium pipe, and with a clamp I held it down to expose the circlip. With that removed, I tried my best to pull the damper assembly out without making a mess, and failed pretty miserably. Still a bit of pressure. Using a socket and the clamp, I did the same thing with the reservoir, exposing the circlip so I could remove it. I threaded on a metal valve cap to give me something to grab onto in order to pull the bladder out of the reservoir. These bits all look good, so they'll just get a clean up before reassembly. Next, I removed the compression damping adjuster. With that all apart, I could take the main body to the parts washer to give it all a good clean. With everything clean, I took out a selection of parts so I could prepare them for zinc plating, starting with a warm bath in rust remover. And while that works its magic, I can grind back the end of the shaft to allow the nut to come off. I transferred the shim stacks and piston onto one of the linkage bolts, so I don't mess up the order or lose anything. I transferred the shim stacks and piston onto one of the linkage bolts, so I don't mess up the order or lose anything. I transferred the shim stacks and piston onto one of the linkage bolts, so I don't mess up the order or lose anything. I'll need to remove the burr on this thread before reassembly. I carefully removed the seal head, the end cap, and finally the bump stop. I took the hardware over to the sandblaster and worked through the parts, removing the last remaining dirt and any corrosion. I think they came up pretty well. God, I love having this thing in the workshop. To do a proper job of cleaning up the top bracket, I unscrewed the rebound adjuster, being sure not to lose the two ball bearings and the springs as they fall out. I managed to find a brand new bump stop, so I opened that to compare it, making sure it was the right size. Who would have thought it wasn't meant to be black? Time to get plating. I'm starting to get my head around the process, and down the line I'll definitely do a standalone video on sharing what I've picked up. I prepared the first batch of parts, suspending them from the bus bar with copper wire. After cleaning, they had a short bath in the acid dip, and after a final rinse and a water break test to check they were clean, they went in the plating tank. Now this is actually one of the first batches of parts I plated, hence why I'm cross-checking everything with the instructions that come with the kit. One thing I'll definitely recommend is pay the extra for the power supply. It just makes it so much easier getting the right current. The general rule is 0.1 amps per square inch of surface area, and when you've got a lot of threaded parts like these, that can add up quite quickly. They look like they're plating nicely, so I can get to work preparing the next batch. That fizzing is the old plating coming off the bracket. Well, they look ready. I'll see if I can take them out without dropping any.
Fuck.
Apparently not. I used a magnet to retrieve it, and as it turns out, I messed up the plating. So I put it back in the acid to remove that plating and start again. I gave the other bits a bit of a clean up. It's really important to remove all of the electrolyte from the parts before you start passivation. Anything left on there can cause streaks when it dries. A few more seconds in the acid helps with this, and it also etches the plating, which helps the passivation process. Here's the next two parts, before plating and after. I left all the parts to air dry overnight, and then put them back in the box with all the other clean parts. I'd managed to source new seals and a bushing from Racetech in California, which would give me the peace of mind knowing they'd been replaced, even though the shipping cost was 3 times what they're worth. The bump stop came off with a gentle pry, but the washer was held in by the rim, which had been peened over. After some head scratching, I thought I'd start with the dust seal on the other side so I could replace the bushing. I used sockets in the vise for this, which seemed to work well pushing the old bush out.
It's happening. Oh, good. So you didn't need no expensive tools. There's the old one. A bit fucked.
I unpeened the rim with pliers, which wasn't ideal, but it meant I could get the washer out so I could replace the main seal. I smeared the new seal with rubber grease and pressed it into place. I used the sockets and the vise again to press the new bushing in. I put the washer and bump stop back in and then tried my best to re-peen the rim with a small hammer. Now annoyingly, I'd noticed the dust seal was the wrong size, which meant I had to put the old one back on. I put some tape over the threads of the rod and fed the seal head onto the shaft. With that on, I transferred the piston and shim stacks back onto the shaft and wound the nut back on. With a little bit of grease to keep them in place, I reinstalled the 2 springs and ball bearings under the rebound adjuster, then fitted the knob with a new bolt. A quick check to make sure that it's all working and I was getting my clicks, and that's that done. Then I torqued up the nut and gave it a ding with a punch to prevent it loosening. Okay, so now that all this is cleaned up, it's time to put it back together. Okay, let me explain. Now I had been on the fence before about whether or not I restore the old shock or if I upgrade to something new, and I really did want to have a go at refurbishing it. But when reassembling, the seal head was really stiff on the shaft, which I think could be a result of me driving the bushing in with a socket instead of the proper tool, ultimately damaging it. Not to mention the dust seal didn't fit, so I had to use the old one, so that swung me. I ordered the YSS one, as they're well reviewed, and I've been happy with the one that I put on the Ep5. I guess this is how it goes with this sort of stuff. Sometimes you win, sometimes you fail, but I plan on sharing the failures as much as the wins. In an attempt to finish the job in spirit, I began reassembling the original shock. I put a new valve core in and pumped up the bladder to seat it against the circlip, then released the air. I knew this was going to be a learning curve, filling with oil and bleeding out any air. I topped it up from the compression adjuster hole, and I raised that part up to allow any air bubbles to work their way out. After a bit of pumping, I wasn't getting any more bubbles, so I filled up the last bit and I fitted the adjuster to seal it up. Do you know, it's been really bugging me. I was so close with this shock. And yeah, I could order another part from California, get it here and try again. But I don't think I've really exhausted all the other options. I found that K-Tech did complete seal head kits in the right size. And they cost less than the shipping costs for the last bits. Okay, now this changes everything. If this works, we're back in business. I stripped it back down and removed the busted seal head. Then took the new one and compared the two. Looks good to me. I taped the threads again and fitted the new head on, followed by the shim stacks and piston. Okay, let's try this again. Well, it already feels much better, moving in and out quite freely and helping to bleed all the air out of the main body. I temporarily fitted the adjuster so I could give it a proper plunging and then carried on. Well, that feels good to me, and all the damping adjustments seem to work. I guess it's time to address this crusty spring. I gave it a good blasting to remove the paint and corrosion. Then I gave it a wipe down before giving it a coat of primer and 3 coats of gloss black. That looks good to me. After that dried, I span the lock nut on and then the preload adjuster and the washer, ready to fit the spring. In went the spring seat. I pressed the bump stop back up inside it and then span down the preload adjusters to hold it all in place. There we go, looking good. But we're not quite done. It's going to need a new reservoir cap. So I fitted a new dust cap to the valve, then I measured the size I needed, but rather than look for one online, I thought I'd try and make my own. It's quite a simple design to model, but I wanted to make it a little bit more special and unique, so I added the ZX7R logo to go on top. I'm happy with that, so I sent it to the 3D printer. Then I cleaned it up and gave it a test fit, but I didn't like it in black, so I gave it a coat of silver paint. I think we can all admit, that's pretty cool, right? Looking back at how it came off the bike, and despite the challenges, I'd call that a success. But it's not going to go back on the bike, and I'll keep hold of it as a spare, and as a bit of a trophy of perseverance. So let's get that new one fitted. Before I could, I needed to fit the rest of the hardware. This also meant checking the position of the ride height adjuster and setting that. Not that it's the same shock, but it makes sense for it to start where it was.
Oh, you're having a laugh, aren't you? It's not happening, Graham.
With the nut on, I could tighten up the bolts and torque them up. I fitted a fresh cotter pin at the end of the bolt and trimmed the ends. Then I put its little hat on. All done. Oh, bollocks, I forgot the bloody bracket thing. I blasted that and I painted it satin black. But that was a fun one. Glad I followed through and refurbished that. And I hope it's useful for anyone that's thinking about doing it themselves. Now this does take me to where I am in the real world, and even though I've made good progress on the forks and wheels, I'm still waiting on some parts to complete them. So hopefully it won't be too long before I can get those videos out. One thing I have done based on some of your comments is I took the bottom yoke back out and I gave it a coat of paint to protect it. I had hoped to keep the brush finished, but it is going to be out of sight anyway, so in that case, corrosion protection is more important. So make sure you're subscribed and you've got your bell thing on, and hopefully it won't be too long till I'm back with the next one. I'll see you then.